Ben Franklin's World is a production of the Omohundro Institute. Hello, and welcome to episode 266 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. And I'm your host, Liz Covart. How did early Americans educate their children? How did boys and girls learn the trades that they would practice later in life? And how and when did Americans create a formal system of public education? These are questions you sent me for episode 200, which was our listener question and answer episode about different aspects of early American life. In fact, you sent me a lot of questions for that episode. You asked me to get answers to questions about the post office, transportation, health and hygiene, and of course, to these questions about education in early America. I had so much material for episode 200 that I had to make some really hard cuts as I edited the episode together. Because if I hadn't made some hard cuts, we would have had a multi-hour episode. So one of the hard decisions and cuts I had to make was to Johann Niem's answers to your questions about how early Americans learned trade skills. But I saved your questions and Johann's answers to them, knowing that one day I'd have an opportunity to share them with you. Well, that day is today. Today, I offer you a different kind of episode. It's an episode that doesn't feature our customary introductory, time warp, or concluding segments. But it does offer you an entire conversation with Johann Niem and more answers to your questions about everyday life in early America. Now, if you'll recall, Johann Niem is a professor of history at Western Washington University and one of the foremost experts in the history of education in early America. His most recent book on this subject is Democracy Schools: The Rise of Public Education in America. He also has a brand new book out called What's the Point of College? Seeking Purpose in an Age of Reform. So, during our full-length conversation with Johann reveals information about the apprenticeship system and how it worked, the indentured system, and the ways in which the American Revolution impacted that system, and details about the rise of formal public education in the early United States. But first, I wish you and your family a wonderful holiday and a very happy Thanksgiving. Happy Thanksgiving! Okay, let's go catch up with Johann and get more answers to your questions about education in early America. Our guest is a professor of history at Western Washington University. He's an expert in the American Revolutionary and early Republic periods and in the history of education in early America. He's also the author of 2 books, including Democracy Schools: The Rise of Public Education in America. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Johann Niem.
Thank you for having me on the show.
Johann, the pleasure is all ours. Now, as you know, you're an expert on education in early America, and we really have 2 different types of questions related to that topic for you. The first set of questions really inquires about how early Americans learned and acquired trade skills, while the second set of questions asks about a subject that you know quite well, which is about the founding and development of formal schools in the early Republic. So why don't we start with the first set of questions? Brian would like to know about the practice of apprenticeship. Would you tell us about apprenticeships and about the origins of the system of education?
So, in many ways, the origins of apprenticeship is European. And in English law, going back to the 1300s and 1500s, there were statutes governing labor and governing servitude. Those statutes and those practices came across the Atlantic with the European settlers, with the English settlers to the New World. So in some ways, it's a very old institution that was imported with the earliest settlers.
When we think about apprenticeships in Europe, many of us think about the European guild system. Was the system of apprenticeship that developed in North America related to that guild system?
It does. In European guilds, the idea was that people would be trained in a craft, and then they would enter into that craft as independent craftsmen. And historians divide over to the extent to which this was also a way of controlling competition and creating monopolies. Some argue, particularly in the wake of free market ideas, that this was really an anti-competitive project. But others argue that there was actually very little effort to limit production, and it really had to do with training and preparing and controlling quality. But it certainly was linked to the guild system. What's interesting is that the guild system never really took hold in the colonies. And so you didn't have, for various reasons, both colonial law, the fact that colonial society was less structured, that it was more easy to exit, that you never really created the same kind of guild structure, although you had very strong indentured systems. And one of the big innovations was most indentures had to do with an exchange of labor for training. And that was the deal. You'd get trained as a cooper or a brewer. And what happened in the New World was, for a large number of people who migrated, the exchange was really you exchange your labor for the cost of your voyage. So for a lot of people who came less than training, there were a lot of people who came, worked on people's farms or in their shops, and they were in effect repaying the cost of transportation.
You mentioned the indentured system and indentures, and this was something that Benjamin Franklin actually talked about in his autobiography. Now, Franklin, of course, was trained as a printer and apprenticed with his brother James. And in his autobiography, he discusses the indentures and what it meant to be bound out to his brother. So I wonder if you could tell us more about indentured papers and what it meant for people to bind out their labor.
Sure. The thing we need to remember is that this was a society where people were not seen as free in the sense that we see them as free, that people expected to have some kind of dependent relationship with others. My colleague Jared Hardesty calls this a society that accepted unfreedom as a natural state. And so being bound out sounds to us like something terrible, but for many people, it was an opportunity to gain training. So how it worked was that people would actually sign a contract of indenture, and the contract of indenture would elaborate the terms of an agreement. Usually it stated what the person who was benefiting from the servant's labor would provide. And so often you'd provide training, you'd provide food and board. Colonial laws often required a certain amount of literacy training in the North that was linked to religious education and the expectation, especially in places like Massachusetts, that everyone be able to read the Bible themselves. So you needed literacy. And in return, the servant agreed to provide their labor for a set term of years. And they were varied. People say, well, it was about 7 years, but sometimes for kids, it would be for a few years, sometimes until 21 when they reached the age of majority. But these contracts could be negotiated. There wasn't just one set contract, but they were governed in general by laws that date back to the 1500s that had to do with master-servant relationships. And so there was some statutory law that sort of general outlines for every contract.
Okay, so the term of an indenture could vary. It was something that people negotiated how many years they'd work for someone else. But was there an average age for people who signed indentures or who were bound out to a master craftsman to learn a trade?
It depended. Parents would sometimes allow their children to be bound out and in effect turn over parental duties to another person in order to train their children. And that could happen when kids were, in their early teens and it was time for them to learn a vocation and get out of the house. It eased the burden on families often. But adults themselves would often bind themselves to another if they wanted training, or particularly for people who wanted passage across the Atlantic, they would often bind themselves to another. Sometimes they'd arrive actually on the ships to Virginia or to Philadelphia, and they would arrive having not paid their passage, and someone would pay them in return for a certain amount of years of labor. So adults as well as children would be bound out. But of course, adults could bind themselves, which sounds weird to us because we don't expect ourselves to be bound. But that sounds weird to us because of the American Revolution.
How did the American Revolution impact this system?
Well, the Revolution had a dramatic impact on servitude. Some people say that, if not the majority, a large plurality of people who came in the colonial era came as indentured servants or served at some point in their lives as indentured servants. What happens after the Revolution is that servitude comes to be seen as closer to slavery. The idea that another person has a full claim on you, and it's a kind of parental claim. The master is the head of the household and you belong to the master's household. That didn't sit well with the revolutionary rhetoric that all people are created equal, or that all men are created equal, because of course the revolution did not achieve equality for all women yet. But for laborers, suddenly the idea that you are fully in the control of someone else, you must live in their household, didn't sit well. And so both the legal system started to move to what's called free labor, but increasingly both masters and servants found the system both ideologically untenable, but in some ways economically untenable. Masters, in the context of industrialization, didn't want to be responsible for the full care of another person, while laborers themselves wanted to have their own houses and their own families and be equally free people to their masters. And so the system didn't jive with both changing economic conditions and changing ideas about equality.
Speaking of equality, Beth is curious whether any trades and apprenticeships were open to women. So, did women have any opportunities to become skilled in a trade, or was it just men and boys who were able to sign indentures and bind themselves out?
So both boys and girls were apprenticed and bound out to be indentured servants. One statistic from colonial Philadelphia says that girls were apprenticed, but the records suggest they were less than 1/5 of indentured. And most often they were learning housewifery. So they were not necessarily learning the same kinds of trades that young boys would learn. They were not becoming artisanal craftspeople. They were learning skills that more often would be associated with their gender. There were still advantages if you were a family and you bound out your daughter, that person would, for a while no longer be a burden, an economic burden on their family, and they would gain skills. But the record is kind of murky in terms of the extent to which girls were bound out.
Okay, now it's time to transition into our second set of questions about education in early America. Walter wonders about the development of free schools in early America. So, would you tell us when and why early Americans started founding and supporting free schools and education?
Americans started supporting free education really in the 1820s and 30s, if we think about free education as tax-supported school terms. Now, after the revolution, there was a lot of rhetoric in favor of increasing access to public education. And even in the 1790s and early 1800s, you had some states like New York and Massachusetts and some other places starting to provide tax support to schooling. What often happened was you'd have often a tax-supported term that might be open to all people, and then parents would pay for an extended term with the teacher if they wanted, or the taxes would only cover a portion of the schooling, and families would kick in what was called a rate fee, tuition, to pay for the schools. Around the 1820s, 30s, there was a bigger push for universal tax-supported education, and you start to see the increasing use of taxation to pay the cost of schooling. And by the Civil War, most northern states have free public elementary schools, and they're moving towards free high schools. And the southern states haven't quite got there, but they're actually moving in the same direction for white students. And the Civil War changes the dynamic in the South in interesting ways, but they're following the same trend prior to the Civil War for their white population.
It's really interesting to me that you note that the movement for free education started in the 1820s and 1830s, because I know I've read laws from the colonial period that show that Massachusetts towns had to support schools. And I know that Boston founded the Boston Latin School for boys in 1635 and a girls' school in 1636. So, were these schools part of the free education system, or were they founded as part of a different movement and different set of ideas?
Yeah, that's a really good question. History doesn't always move in a linear progression. So colonial Massachusetts did have laws that provided a kind of tiered level of schooling so that there would be elementary literacy for all children, often provided by tax support, and then grammar schools for people who had the money to pay for it, or in some cases were chosen by town leaders or others. But by the revolution, that system had started to falter, and the revolution created a new spur. So in Massachusetts in the 1780s, you have a renewed effort to recreate that town-based system. through tax support. And Massachusetts is one of the earliest to move towards what we think of as a public system in which taxes are the source of income. But even in Massachusetts, schools relied on lots of in-kind support from families, from boarding teachers to providing wood for the schoolhouse to, in many cases, actually paying rate fees. But Massachusetts is a leader in the shift towards public education, and that builds on this colonial heritage.
Now, regional variation in schools is something that interests us, and it sounds like systems of education, whether we're talking about the colonial period or in the new United States, may have varied by region. So, would you tell us more about these variations?
There was a lot of regional diversity, but what's more interesting to me is the fact that places like Massachusetts and New York acted as leaders and states started to emulate them. So you see in places like North Carolina and Alabama and Ohio references to what's happening in places like New York and Massachusetts. And how can we make that happen here? And so there is a real kind of national movement, but it's not national in the sense that it's organized by some national organization or by the federal government, but rather through the exchange of ideas and emulation among states. But schools themselves were locally governed institutions. State legislatures often created the spur to schooling by providing initially incentives for communities to organize schoolhouses. For example, they'd say, we'll give you X amount of taxation if your community forms a district, holds a meeting, and agrees to raise this many taxes locally. So in a sense, state legislatures acted as a nudge, and then people started to organize locally. And part of that was legislatures simply didn't have a bureaucracy. They had to build from the bottom up. But as they built and as schools started to get off the ground, the nudges became pushes. So almost every state then starts to mandate a certain term, whether it's 3 months or 5 months, that districts build schoolhouses. So you start to move from nudges to mandates, but the work is happening locally and districts were fairly small. This is before cars, so people needed to be able to get to school. And so these were locally governed institutions, but they weren't completely autonomous from state legislation. Legislatures were often pushing and prodding in different ways to encourage local activity.
I think you've described a grassroots movement. Was it a grassroots movement for education that prompted Americans to start founding schools? And if it was, why were local communities and Americans really encouraged to support schools and education? What were behind these movements?
Yeah, it's not actually one or the other. I think in many early settlement societies, as the nation expanded westward, schools were one of the first institutions to develop, and they often developed as kind of informal, what we would call private associations. Someone would set up a school, a teacher would offer services, and over time, that community would build a schoolhouse, perhaps for that person. So there was a grassroots element in many communities, but the push to make this a mass education system required the state legislature to act and required the kind of nudges and incentives that legislation could provide. Why would people do it? I think there were lots of reasons. I think for some people, it had to do with the principles of citizenship, that citizens needed to be literate. And so for many advocates of public schools, that was a primary criteria. For others, it had to do with providing economic opportunities for their children. And certainly, as more children went to school, it became a social norm. So being left out became more of a stigma. And as that happened, people started to push for greater access. Greater access meant trying to shift the burden from parents paying to taxpayers paying. So there were lots of pressures pushing people towards expanding access, and they weren't all the same reasons, but they kind of converged to build support for public schools. But that doesn't mean that all Americans agreed on the extent or kind of education. These were divisive institutions as well.
A lot of access in early America was determined by one's wealth, race, and gender. So when you talk about greater access to schools, are we talking about greater access for both boys and girls?
That's right. And one of the interesting things about the public schools as they develop in the 19th century in the United States is that they were open to both boys and girls. Now, it's more complicated. You asked about regional variation. It's a little more complicated. In the South, where the public schools are a little later to develop, So elite boys and girls would be trained in academies that were private charter schools that charged a tuition. And even in the North, these academies offered middle class as well as elite boys and girls access to education that they would not have had before. And they were often local institutions relying on local philanthropy. But boys and girls, interestingly enough, enrolled in the common schools at pretty equal rates. And as the first public high schools started to emerge, there was even some concern that girls were staying in school longer while boys were often not learning the basics. And part of that, I think, has to do with the fact that for boys, there were a lot of other economic opportunities. And for girls, in some ways, especially middle class girls, getting an education was both something that they could use in terms of finding a mate, but it also was something to do when you didn't have the other kinds of economic opportunities. And for boys, there might be, as you become a teenager, you could work on the farm, you could get a trade, you could move on. And today we see education as so central to our future economic success, but that just wasn't the case in the 19th century.
What about colleges and institutions of higher education? Jerome would like to know when and why Americans began founding these educational institutions.
Well, the earliest colleges were founded in the colonial era, and they were, in the case of New England, places like Harvard and Yale, they were places to cultivate the next generation of leaders, particularly ministers as well as political leaders, and to ensure you had an educated, pious, local ruling class. And that was kind of the purpose of colleges. And it wasn't seen as something that most people would do. And so there was a kind of sensibility that every colony would have one college. And so, for example, when the Baptists were looking to try to start a college, even though a lot of the money came from other colonies, Rhode Island was a choice because it wouldn't compete with another college in the area. And so there was this idea that the colleges were a place that represented where a ruling class was forged. After the revolution, you start to see the proliferation of colleges for all kinds of reasons, one of which is this idea that one college or institution has an inherent monopoly started to break away. There were ideas of competition. There were ideas of religious pluralism that fragmented this idea that there could be one college and one ruling class. You also had more educated people as people were coming out of the common schools and out of the academies who were eligible for some higher education. So you see a big expansion, a proliferation of new colleges growing throughout the new United States, especially as Americans moved west. And as you had denominational competition and religious pluralism, different groups also wanted to educate their children. And so you have a kind of blossoming of higher education in the 1810s, 20s, 30s that is quite remarkable.
And how were these institutions of higher education funded? Were they financed the way that common schools were financed, with taxpayer support?
Most were not. Some were. And so places like Harvard, for example, which was seen as the public school for Massachusetts for most of its history, the public college, they would sometimes receive one-time tax support. They would sometimes receive gifts of land that they could use to generate revenue for support of the college. And sometimes new chartered institutions would receive similar things as well. And some of the states tried to provide tax support or other kinds of in-kind support for new public colleges. And so you start to see places in North Carolina, for example, efforts to create a new public institution that would be a civic institution for that state and serve the needs of a republic. Of course, Thomas Jefferson's efforts to forge the University of Virginia is one of the most famous. And so you do start to see increasingly that there is some idea that public colleges deserve public support, but they weren't supported by the kind of local regular taxation that you had in the common school. So tuition as well as in-kind support of land and other kinds of things that states had to offer mattered more.
We've talked a lot about formal schools and systems of education, but Chris has a question about more informal types of education. Chris would like to know whether early Americans were into self-improvement, and if they were, what kinds of books, articles, and workshops they were reading and attending to improve themselves.
Well, the answer is yes. I mean, I think one of the amazing parts of the post-revolutionary decades was just how much ordinary people loved learning. We see this in working men's associations that started to build their own libraries, and people would meet to share ideas. Often you'd have someone in the association give a talk or a speech. You also see the proliferation of formal ways of engaging with learning, including the Athenaeum movement. You have Athenaeum springing up across the country with lectures. Some of the famous ones were people like Ralph Waldo Emerson or Frederick Douglass, but there were lots of lesser known lecturers who were either famous in their time or locally celebrated, and people would congregate to hear. And there was a sense that human beings had more potential, but that potential had to be developed. And there was a democratic spirit about learning. And I think that actually supported the formal systems because many people who would learn on their own in various kinds of voluntary associations, in working men's associations, in new kind of voluntary libraries, as well as through formal lectures like the Athenaeum, started to get a sense of what learning could provide. And I think that helped build support for wanting to offer a more formal education for children.
Now, as you've researched the history of education in early America and in the early United States, is there a lesson or any information about education in early America that you think we'd do well to know about? Is there something about how early Americans thought about education or how they established their schools that carries forth into our own time?
Yeah, I think there is. I think, we're at a crossroads in the history of education in the United States today. And it's entirely plausible that there might be some states a decade from now that have moved away from the common school model altogether as policies that support either charter schools or school choice or vouchers take hold. And that may or may not happen, but we're clearly at a moment where we're rethinking or asking fundamental questions. I guess what interests me in some ways is there's two lessons I took while I was writing my book. First off was the ways in which advocates of public education really believed in creating a system that provided the same education to all people and that the purposes of education were public. The primary purpose for the revolutionary generation was to cultivate citizens. By the 1820s and 30s, there's also an idea that a liberal education will develop the unique talents and capabilities of ordinary people. And so in a democracy, democratizing access to the arts and sciences became a mission. And the third one, which is hard for us to think about today, but is really important, is the question of diversity. As Americans became more diverse, as immigration increased in the 1830s, 40s, 50s, there was an understanding that public schools would be places where different groups of people would become Americanized. And historians have been very critical of that from the left and right. Today, we're facing the question where on the right, advocates of choice believe we're too religiously diverse to go to school together. And some advocates on the left say a multicultural society shouldn't impose any common vision of the nation on others. And so if that's true, we have to ask ourselves, do we still want our public schools to have these public purposes? And I guess one of the lessons I took is I think those are the questions we need to ask. Where instead of asking ourselves about specific policy questions, we need to take a step back and say, what are the fundamental functions of public schools? And then ask how to achieve them. And for me, that's my hope, is that the book asks those questions and puts those public purposes back on the table.
Johann, thank you so much for joining us and for telling us so much about early American systems of education in schools. And I know we've only just scratched the surface of these subjects. So before we conclude, I wonder, do you have any books, articles, or digital resources you could recommend for us? In case we're inclined to go do a bit of research on our own?
I think if you want to learn more about the indentured systems and how artisans were prepared, and especially the impact on the revolution, William Rohrbach's book on the craft apprentice is still a great resource. And if we want to think about how the legal system around that worked, I would recommend Robert Steinfeld's book, The Invention of Free Labor, because he does a good job showing why what we think of as free labor, the ability to leave your job at will or the ability of your employer to fire you at will, why that emerged after the revolution and how it was distinguished from early modern ideas of labor and servitude. So those would be two places to go. There's a lot of great work being done on public culture and Athenaeums. And one of the great classic books remains Joseph Kett's book, The Pursuit of Knowledge Under Difficulties. And he goes from 1750 to 1990, and he shows how learning, we tend to think sometimes, and teachers sometimes would argue this in the 1830s and 40s, particularly when they wanted to use the rod, that you have to force people to learn. But he shows that from the 1750s to today, there's lots of contexts in which people chose to learn for themselves with other people on their own in organized settings. So the book is called Pursuit of Knowledge Under Difficulties. My book, Democracy Schools, explores the development of the common schools, what their purposes were, how they were built, what teachers did in the classrooms, and is a way of sort of thinking about these institutions that today seem very fragile and very contested. Why did they come about in the first place? And what were they trying to accomplish? And what can we learn from that as we think about how to move forward in today's setting, and what kind of public education system or systems do we want to offer for our democracy in the future?
So now you have more answers to your questions about education in early America. And if you'd like to explore other aspects of life in early America, be sure you check out episode 200, Everyday Life in Early America. That's the episode where we tackle your questions about the post office and health and hygiene. And also be sure to check out episode 239. That's our unabridged conversation with Joseph Edelman about the post office and transportation in early America. Now, I've included links to these episodes, as well as to more information about Johann, his book Democracy Schools, plus notes and links for everything we talked about today, all in the show notes page. benfranklinsworld.com/266. If you enjoy Ben Franklin's World, please tell your friends and family about it. Production assistance for this podcast comes from the Omohundro Institute's Digital Projects team. Joseph Edelman, Martha Howard, Caleb Pittman, Holly White, and Karen Wolf. Breakmaster Cylinder composed our custom theme music. Finally, what more would you like to know about everyday life in early America? Let me know. Liz@benfranklinsworld.com. Ben Franklin's World is a production of the Omohundro Institute.